Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the state of the American empire with Professor Noam Chomsky.
We just saw we have the most wonderful military system in the world to defend America. And if you look at the oath of office that the Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, takes, it's to defend America against enemies, foreign and domestic. So we have this magnificent military to defend us against domestic enemies. Was it able to defend the Capitol a couple of days on January 6th? Not that I noticed.
Professor Noam Chomsky, the pioneering linguist, prolific author of numerous seminal political works, including The Fateful Triangle, Manufacturing Consent, Failed States and Requiem for the American Dream, and America's most important intellectual, along with Marv Waterstone, Professor Emeritus at the University of Arizona, explore the failures and inherent cruelties spawned by global capitalism in their new book, Consequences of Capitalism, Manufacturing Discontent and Resistance. They argue that the rampant, endless wars, both hot and cold, the unchecked militarism these conflicts spawn, along with a raging ecocide, unparalleled levels of global wealth and income inequality are fueling system breakdown and the rise of repressive and authoritarian regimes that revoke basic liberties, rule through fear and coercion, and speak in the toxic rhetoric of hate and violence. This descent into a species of corporate totalitarianism and the ecocide that accompanies it, threatening the human species and most other species with extinction, will only be halted, they argue, by radically reorganizing human societies, politically, economically, and culturally. Joining me to discuss where we are and where we must go is Professor Noam Chomsky. So in the book, you talk, there's a lot of great stuff in there. You talk about, how we perceive reality. And I want you to discuss that how is our cultivated perception of reality a form of social control? Of course, you refer to Gramsci.
Well, we're seeing pretty dramatic examples of it right now. There's a huge part of the population which not only sees, but is deeply committed to an alternative reality which has no basis in fact and is entirely the opposite of all evidence, but they cling to it religiously. And in fact, you've seen plenty of it in your experience in the media. They have a reality of their own. So that's the reality of the liberal intellectual elite, which is that the United States is always trying to do good things, but makes mistakes here and there. And we have to correct these mistakes, but everything is fundamentally wonderful. So this assault on the Capitol shows the power of American democracy, because we didn't collapse into a fascist state, very much like the reaction after Watergate, odes to the magnificence of the democratic system, when right after the demonstration of corruption and evasion in the effort to conceal what happened. For example, the Watergate, striking in Watergate, that the only serious charges against Nixon were eliminated. They were introduced by Robert Drinan, Jesuit priest, representative from Massachusetts, who insisted that they include the bombing of Cambodia, which was one of the most horrendous acts of the period, certainly of the Nixon administration. But that was cut off, and was left was attacks on the Democratic Party headquarters, things like that. Bad, but nothing like the serious crimes. And that enabled us to show that American democracy and its magnificence had triumphed. And we're seeing a kind of a replica of that now. There's some really serious ills, bipartisan incidentally, although the Republicans have gone off the spectrum. But those are not being discussed. What's being discussed is a crazed mob, as if they came out of nowhere. They didn't come out of nowhere.
In your classic book that you wrote with Ed Herman, Manufacturing Consent, you talk about that process by which the dominant narrative is kind of inculcated within the public. And yet we've seen now with the rise of digital media, there's a bifurcation within the media. There are kind of two dominant narratives. People are now siloed within their own particular prejudices, or their own particular worldview is catered to, and of course their proclivities are monitored and fed back to them. I wonder if you could just go back and look at that work. It was the great work in terms of dissecting the media, and talk about now in this age of digital media how that dominant narrative is essentially ingested within the public to get people to ultimately call for their own enslavement.
Well, remember that the book, substantially Ed Herman's, the late Ed Herman's, why I insisted that his name be first on our joint publication, contrary to our usual alphabetic ordering. But the main framework is his. But it was focused on the sources of news and information, the major media. Now, the social media are a new phenomenon, and they're very significant, but they don't affect the source of information. Twitter doesn't have reporters in, Beirut seeing what's happening. What they do is take we still have the same major information sources, and I think they're pretty much like they were in the past. Maybe a little more open than in the past, because a lot of young people who went through the activism of the 60s and the aftermath have since moved into media, which has given them a slightly different and more open complexion. But the social media are over and above that. They take the picture of the world that's fed to them by the major media, and as you say, they bifurcate it. Much in the way that talk radio has done for many years. I used to listen to it constantly, and it's an alternative world where you hear nothing else but the extreme right, and plenty of people are caught up into it. Now we have that exaggerated with the social media maximizing that effect. And of course, it has increased irrationality on all sides. If you only have your own views echoed back to you, you're not going to think. You should be reading and thinking much more broadly.
You've often written about how the very words and phrases that are fed to us essentially exclude other ways of seeing the world. For example, the war on terror, which is a kind of tautology. You can't have a war on terror. And talk a little bit about how the kind of the constant repetition of certain words and phrases limit our capacity to see reality.
Well, take war on terror. The United States is one of the major terrorist forces in the world, but the war on terror doesn't apply. In fact, I started writing on terrorism back around the early 80s when Ronald Reagan came in. As you recall, the struggle against terrorism was going to be the centerpiece of our policy. No more talk about human rights. Now the grand issue is the war on terror, the plague of the modern terrorism, the plague of the modern age, and so on. The terrorism he was talking about was resistance to U.S. terrorism in Central America. That was the prime case of it, and also South Africa. Remember that for the Reagan administration, to the very end, Mandela's African National Congress was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. Mandela himself was not permitted into the United States till many years after, decades after apartheid ended, took a special congressional resolution to allow him in because of a leading terrorist. So the concept of terrorism in the early Reagan years was interestingly inverted. The terrorists were not terrorists. the people who were not terrorists are terrorists. And it was, when I began writing about this, I started using the U.S. Code for its definition of terror and the U.S. Army manuals. And if you look at their definitions, what the Reagan administration was doing was the peak of terrorism by our own definitions. In fact, the World Court accepted the same conclusion. The United States is the only country to have been brought before the World Court and to have been condemned for international terrorism. The words that they used were unlawful use of force, which is international terrorism. And here goes back to your point, how did the U.S. react to that? Almost nobody knows about it. Actually, the New York Times, I don't recall whether you were on the Times in those days, but the New York Times had an editorial saying we can dismiss the judgment of the court because it's a hostile forum. Why is it a hostile forum? Because it condemned the United States. So since it's a hostile forum, who cares what they say? And that was the end of the court judgment condemning the U.S. for terrorism. You look over the media discussion, same right until today. So, for example, the U.S. ran an extraordinary terrorist campaign against Cuba for years. The idea was to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba, as it was described by Arthur Schlesinger, the associate of John F. Kennedy, who launched the campaign. How's that described in the United States? Some silly actions by the CIA trying to, burn Castro's beard, little hanky-pank. It wasn't that. It was a serious terrorist war. It almost led to the destruction of the world. It was one of the main factors that led to the Cuba Missile Crisis. Kennedy himself had authorized in August 1962 escalation of the terrorist activities in Cuba with the intent of leading to an uprising in October, which would be followed by an American invasion. October 1962. Okay? It was no joke. Do you ever see any discussion of it? No, it's just war on terror. When Bush relaunched the war on terror, not launched, relaunched in 2001, it was those terrorists out there we have to go after, not our own terrorist acts. And this is a brilliant example of how internalized understanding, it's not even propaganda, I think it's internalized. You can't, just as you can't get the Republican mobs to admit that the election was lost, you can't get liberal American intellectuals to recognize that the United States is a leading terrorist state. It's just not us. I mean, maybe some mistakes, maybe some bad guys, but not our consistent activities. What defines us is our pursuit of democracy. And it's very interesting how that's dealt with.
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to stop you there, Noam. Just have to take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky about the state of the American empire. Welcome back. We continue our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky about the state of the American empire. You were talking about that kind of mythology of a transcendent purpose, and in the book you reference Antonio Gramsci, and you talk about the difference between organic and traditional intellectuals. Can you lay out that distinction for us?
Well, for Gramsci, an organic intellectual was an intellectual who embedded himself in activist social movements and tried to help use whatever special talents or privileges they had to carry forward the popular efforts for carrying the world forward in a better direction. Those are organic intellectuals. Dissidents, we call them in other countries. Then there are the traditional intellectuals who are what are called stenographers for power often. Actually, Henry Kissinger, who was a perfect model, described them once. He said, the goal of the political intellectual is to articulate the ideas and concerns of people in power in a more proper and careful way. That's the job of the intellectual. Serve power. So if Nixon hands to me, Henry Kissinger, an order to bomb Cambodia and destroy everything, my job as a intellectual, responsible intellectual, is to present it to the head of the Air Force with the words, massive bombing campaign against Cambodia, anything that moves against anything that flies against anything that moves. In other words, total genocide. That's my duty as a responsible intellectual, to articulate the views and intentions of the people in power, in this case, to call for genocide. Okay, that's one view of the intellectual. There's another view, the ones we honor in enemy countries, but condemn in our own country. It's what McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, called the wild men in the wings, the ones who go beyond saying we made a tactical error, you didn't understand something, and actually look into the motives and goals that we were pursuing. Wild men in the wings. We have to remove them from the body politic, from the intellectual world, not publish what they say, demonize, condemn them, and so on. In our own country, when it's in an enemy country, we idolize them as marvelous dissidents who are courageously standing up to power. This goes all the way back in history, as far as you can go. Go back to Greece. Who was it who had to drink the hemlock? The man who was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking too many questions. We don't want that around, not in a free democracy like Athens. And pretty much the same up to the present.
You reference Orwell about how popular ideas can be silenced, inconvenient facts kept in the dark without official censorship. Can you take us through how that process works?
That's George Orwell. And an interesting article which was suppressed. It was the intended introduction to his book Animal Farm. Animal Farm, of course, everybody's read. Animal Farm, in the introduction, which is called Literary Censorship in England, something like that, he says to the British, where the book was to appear, he says, this, of course, is satire on the totalitarian enemy, but the British shouldn't feel so self-righteous because it's a free country, and in a free country, exactly what you quoted, unwanted ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And then he gave just a few sentences of explanation. One was, the press is owned by wealthy men who do not want certain ideas to be expressed. The other, he said, is basically a good education. You've gone to Oxford, Cambridge. You just have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say, just like other kinds of behavior are unacceptable. These things it wouldn't do to say, things like what we've been talking about. It's a free country, so you're not thrown in prison for saying them. You're just marginalized and cut out in one or another way. I don't have to tell you, you're more familiar than I am. But these are the methods by which, without the use of force, you can ensure beliefs of the most crazy kind without exception. Let me give you another example. Take Bernie Sanders. If you read the left liberal critics in the mainstream press, they say Sanders has really good ideas, but they're too radical for the American people. We just can't go that far. What are his leading ideas? The main one is universal health care. Too radical for the American people. Can you think of a country in the world that doesn't have it? I mean, this is such an insult against the American people. It says, you're so backward and reactionary that you can't have what Mexico has and what France has and what Brazil has because you're so backward. And nobody questions this. Actually, not nobody. One of the best correspondents for the London Financial Times, Rana Forahar, associate editor, had a piece in which he said that if Bernie Sanders was in Germany, he could be running on the Christian Democrat Party program, the right-wing party, because what he's calling for, universal health care, free higher education, it's just taken for granted by conservative parties in Europe. But here it's too radical for Americans. Almost nobody points that out. We could go case after case like this. Take Cuba, for example, which we mentioned before. The United States right now is not carrying out terrorist wars against Cuba, but it has Cuba under a very tight blockade, which is extreme and is opposed by the entire world. When it comes up in the General Assembly every year, universally condemned. Israel votes with the United States, but it has to. So does that matter to anybody? No. They're terrorists, just like Mandela. They support terrorism. They do all kind of bad. They have human rights violations, which is true. In fact, on Cuba, they're the worst human rights violations in the hemisphere. In the southeast corner, a place called Guantanamo, which we stole from Cuba at gunpoint and refused to give back to them. The human rights violations there are the worst in the Western, some of the worst in the Western world. Do you ever hear that? These are
I just want to close by talking about militarism. Karl Liebknecht called militarism the enemy from within. There's no check anymore. It's not like the 1960s where the liberal wing of the Democratic Party might challenge a weapons system. It's the endless wars which have been, aside from all of the suffering that is caused, $7 trillion wasted. Can you talk a little bit about that cancer of militarism?
Well, we just saw we have the most wonderful military system in the world to defend America. And if you look at the oath of office that the Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, takes, it's to defend America against enemies, foreign and domestic. So we have this magnificent military to defend us against domestic enemies. Was it able to defend the Capitol a couple of days on January 6th? Not that I noticed. But you're right. No Democrat will dare to, virtually none, Bernie Sanders did, a couple of others, to oppose a $750 billion military budget. We should never use the word defense. It's a military budget. It has nothing to do with defense. This was an Orwellism. I think it was 1947. All throughout its history, the United States had a Ministry of War. Yes, because we were always at war. The United States is one of those rare countries that's been at war almost every day since its founding. The first war was the invasion of the Indian nations, the destruction of the indigenous population. That was one of the main reasons for the Revolutionary War, was to free the colonists to invade the rest of what is now the territorial country. So first came a century of wars of aggression against the Indian nations, virtual extermination, invasion of Mexico, taking over half of it, expanding into the rest of the world, hardly a day without war. In 1947, when the new Orwellism was imposed, the War Department was changed, and its name was changed to Defense Department. Anyone with eyes open knew there isn't going to be any more defense. There's just going to be war. Yes, so it's the Defense Department. We have a defense budget. Doesn't defend us against domestic enemies. In fact, it doesn't defend us against anybody. It's for war, attack, aggression, no opposition. And so it's not just the War Department. One of the most remarkable things that Trump has done was to dismantle the entire arms control regime. This has been slowly put in place. Much of it goes back to Eisenhower, the Open Skies Treaty. Some of it is Reagan, INF Treaty, all dismantled. It has had some positive effect in reducing the threat of terminal war. And remember, a nuclear war is a terminal war. We're done. It's finished. But has reduced the threat. So let's throw it to the winds. Almost nobody talks about it. Doesn't come up in the presidential campaign, and the hardly a word about it. And the destruction of the arms control regime is accompanied with bipartisan support for development of new, far more dangerous weapons, which increase the threat of terminal nuclear destruction. That's defense, okay?
Coupled with ecocide, of course. We've got to stop there. That was Professor Noam Chomsky, who co-authored with Marv Waterstone the new book, Consequences of Capitalism, Manufacturing, Discontent and Resistance. Thanks, Noam.
Thanks.